I'm a federal ranger, trained to document facts, not feelings. But what I saw near the fire lookout doesn't fit any report template we have. So this is all that's left. My name is Jack Miller, and I have spent 19 years patrolling the Tongass National Forest in southeastern Alaska. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest, the largest national forest in the United States, a sprawling wilderness of ancient Sitka spruce and western hemlock, of fog-shrouded mountains and glacier-fed rivers, of silence so deep it becomes a physical presence pressing against your skull. I have seen grizzlies charge and back down. I have pulled hypothermic kayakers from frigid waters. I have recovered bodies from crevasses and documented plane crashes in valleys so remote that the wreckage would not be found for decades. I thought I had cataloged every horror this land could produce. I was catastrophically wrong. The events I'm about to describe occurred in late October, when the days grow short and the darkness stretches hungry fingers across the forest floor for nearly 18 hours at a time. When the rain turns to sleet and the temperature hovers just above freezing, cold enough to kill, but not cold enough to preserve. When the animals that remain active become desperate and unpredictable, and the forest takes on a character that even the most experienced rangers learn to respect. This is the season when the Tongass reveals its true nature, when the veneer of scenic beauty peels back to expose something older, something that does not welcome human presence, something that watches from the shadows with eyes that reflect no light. I received the call at 0347 on a Tuesday morning. Ranger Thomas Reed, stationed at the Windfall Lake Fire Lookout, had missed his scheduled radio check-in. This was unusual. Reed was meticulous, a former Marine with 15 years of Forest Service experience, the kind of man who synchronized his watch daily and filed reports with military precision. He had been manning the lookout for 6 weeks, monitoring for late-season fires and conducting wildlife surveys in one of the most isolated sections of the Tongass. The lookout sat 43 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by floatplane in good weather or a 4-day hike through some of the densest, most unforgiving terrain in North America. Reed had not missed a check-in once in 6 weeks. Then silence. I tried raising him on the radio for 2 hours, static, dead air. The hiss of empty frequencies that should have carried his voice. By dawn, I knew something was wrong. By noon, I was assembling a search team. By nightfall, we were on our way into the forest, and the nightmare had begun. Henry Collins was my partner for the search. He was younger than me by 8 years, wiry and intense, with the kind of restless energy that made him excellent in emergencies and exhausting during downtime. He had transferred to the Tongass from Olympic National Park 2 years earlier, seeking what he called real wilderness, the kind of isolation that the lower 48 could no longer provide. He found it here, in spades, though I suspect he never imagined how much he would come to regret that search. Collins was good at his job, observant and careful, but he had never experienced the Tongass in late October. He did not yet understand what the forest became when the light failed and the cold settled in. He would learn. We both would. We flew in by floatplane, landing on Windfall Lake as the last light drained from the sky. The pilot, a grizzled bush veteran named Mackenzie, who had been flying these waters for 30 years, refused to wait for us. Said the weather was turning, said he needed to get back before the ceiling dropped. But I saw something else in his eyes. Fear, the kind of fear that experienced men learn to hide but cannot entirely suppress. He looked at the forest surrounding the lake, at the dark wall of trees pressing close to the water's edge, and he wanted to leave. Badly. "Radio when you're ready for pickup," he said, as we unloaded our gear onto the floating dock. "I'll come back when the weather clears. Might be a day, might be a week. You know how it is out here." I knew. The Tongass made its own rules about timing and access. You came when it let you come, and you left when it let you leave. Everything else was negotiation with an indifferent god. The plane's engine roared as Mackenzie taxied across the lake, and then he was airborne, banking hard, disappearing into the gray sky. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds calling, no wind in the trees, no small creatures rustling through the undergrowth. Just stillness, complete and oppressive, pressing down on us like a physical weight. Collins noticed it too. "Quiet," he said, adjusting his pack straps. "Too quiet," I replied, and the words felt inadequate, a cliché that failed to capture the wrongness of that silence. The forest should have been alive with sound, even at this hour, even in this season. Ravens should have been calling, squirrels should have been chattering. Something should have been moving, breathing, existing in that vast expanse of trees. Instead, there was nothing, as if every living thing had fled or was hiding or was holding its breath in anticipation of something we could not yet perceive. The trail to the lookout wound upward through old-growth forest, following the contours of the mountain. The trees here were massive, some of them over 800 years old, their trunks wider than cars, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even during the day, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Moss covered everything, hanging from branches in long curtains, carpeting the ground in a spongy green blanket that muffled our footsteps. Ferns grew waist-high between the trees, their fronds still green despite the season, collecting the constant drizzle and channeling it down to the saturated soil. The air smelled of decay and growth, of things dying and things being born from that death. The endless cycle of a rainforest that had been recycling itself since before humans walked this continent. We hiked in silence, our headlamps cutting weak tunnels through the darkness. The trail was well maintained for the first few miles, marked with regular blazes and cleared of major obstacles. But as we gained elevation, it began to deteriorate. Fallen trees blocked our path every few hundred yards, some of them recent blowdowns with fresh pale wood exposed, others so old they had become nurse logs, sprouting new trees from their rotting backs. The undergrowth grew thicker, grabbing at our packs, leaving scratches on any exposed skin. The silence continued, oppressive and wrong, broken only by our breathing and the wet sounds of our boots on the saturated ground. Around midnight, we stopped to rest at a small clearing. I pulled out my GPS, checked our position. We had covered about 12 miles, roughly a quarter of the distance to the lookout. At this pace, we would reach it by late afternoon the next day. I was about to suggest we make camp when Collins grabbed my arm. "Jack," he whispered. "Listen." I stopped, held my breath, strained my ears. At first, nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound. Not the silence we had been hiking through, but something else. A howl, long and mournful, rising from somewhere deep in the forest to our west. It started low, built to a sustained middle note, then dropped away into silence again. A wolf, I thought at first. The Tongass had wolves, though they were rare this far south. But as the howl faded and I played it back in my memory, I realized it was wrong. The pitch was too low, the duration too long, and there was something in the quality of it. An intelligence, an intentionality, that made my skin crawl. "Wolf?" Collins asked, but his voice carried no conviction. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe." We listened for several minutes, but the sound did not repeat. Eventually, we made camp, setting up our tents in the clearing, building a small fire despite the drizzle. The flames hissed and sputtered but caught, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I found myself staring into those shadows, searching for movement, for eyes, for anything that might explain the wrongness I felt in my bones. Nothing. Just trees and darkness and that oppressive silence. I took first watch while Collins tried to sleep. The fire crackled, the rain dripped, and the forest stood motionless around us. I kept my rifle across my lap, a Remington 700 chambered in .338 Winchester Magnum, powerful enough to stop a grizzly at close range. I had carried this rifle for years, had fired it only twice outside of training, both times to scare off bears that got too curious about our camps. Tonight, I found myself checking and rechecking the magazine, finding comfort in the weight of it, the solidity, as if whatever was out there could be stopped by bullets. The howl came again around 0300, closer this time. Then another answered it, from a different direction. Then a third. They were communicating, I realized. Triangulating, and we were somewhere in the middle of that triangle. I woke Collins, and we sat back to back by the fire, our rifles ready, watching the tree line. The howls continued, growing closer with each repetition, circling our camp in a tightening spiral. I could hear movement now, heavy footsteps in the undergrowth, branches snapping under significant weight. Whatever was out there, there was more than one of them, and they were not small. "Should we move?" Collins whispered. "No, stay by the fire, make noise, let them know we're not prey." I pulled a flare from my pack, ignited it, held it high. The red light painted the clearing in hellish tones, throwing long shadows that seemed to writhe and dance. For a moment, I thought I saw something at the edge of the light, a shape too tall and too narrow to be a bear, standing upright between two massive spruce trees. Then the shape was gone, melted back into the darkness, as if it had never been there. "Did you see that?" Colin's voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fear underneath. "I saw something." "What was it?" "I don't know." We stayed awake until dawn, our backs to the fire, our eyes on the forest. The sounds continued through the night, Footsteps and breathing and occasional vocalizations that sounded almost like words, guttural syllables that carried meaning I could not decode. But nothing approached the fire. Nothing showed itself in the light. When the first gray hints of dawn began to filter through the canopy, the sound stopped. The silence returned, somehow more ominous than ever. We broke camp without speaking, packed our gear with the mechanical efficiency of experienced outdoorsmen, and resumed our hike toward the lookout. Neither of us mentioned what we had heard. Neither of us wanted to give voice to the thoughts racing through our minds. We just walked, faster than before, driven by an urgency that had nothing to do with reaching Reed and everything to do with getting this over with getting out of this forest before whatever was watching us decided to do more than watch. The trail grew steeper as we climbed, switchbacking up the side of a ridge thick with old-growth forest. The trees here were ancient, their trunks scarred by centuries of storms, their roots exposed where erosion had carved away the thin soil. Many of them bore marks I had never seen before, deep gouges running down the bark from a height of 8 or 9 feet, 4 parallel slashes that exposed the white wood beneath. The wounds were old, scarred over with pitch and sap, but unmistakable. Something had marked these trees. Something with claws. Something tall. "Bear?" Collins asked, pointing at one of the marked trees. I shook my head slowly. Bears rubbed against trees, left claw marks when climbing, but nothing like this. These marks were deliberate, methodical, spaced at regular intervals as if marking a boundary, as if warning trespassers that they were entering territory that belonged to something else. "I don't know what made these," I said, "but I don't think it was a bear." We found the first footprint around noon. It was in a patch of soft ground near a stream crossing, preserved in the mud with perfect clarity. The print was enormous, easily 18 inches long, shaped like a human foot but wrong in ways that made my stomach clench. The toes were too long, tipped with what looked like claw marks. The heel was too narrow, and the stride, the distance to the next print, was at least 6 feet. Whatever made this track was tall, heavy, and walked on 2 legs. Collins knelt beside the print, his face pale. "Jack, what the hell is this?" I pulled out my phone, took photos, tried to think of any animal that could leave a track like this. Nothing fit. Grizzlies had 5 toes, but their feet were wider, their stride pattern completely different. Humans could not make prints this large, and the claw marks ruled out any hoax I could imagine. This was something else, something that should not exist. "We keep moving," I said. "Document everything. We'll figure out what it means later." But I already had an idea of what it meant. Growing up in Alaska, I had heard the stories. The native tribes had legends about them, creatures that walked like men but had the heads of wolves, beings that hunted in the deep forests and took those who wandered too far from the safety of villages. The Tlingit called them Kushtaka, though that name referred to something slightly different, a shapeshifter that lured travelers to their deaths. Other tribes had other names, other stories, all of them warning about things that lived in the wild places, things that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. I had dismissed those stories as folklore, cautionary tales meant to keep children close to home. Now, looking at that impossible footprint, I was not so sure. We reached the base of the lookout tower around 1600, just as the light began to fail. The tower rose above the canopy, a wooden structure on stilts, a small cabin perched 60 feet above the forest floor. No smoke came from the chimney. No light showed in the windows. A ladder led up the side, the rungs weathered and slick with rain. "Reed!" I called out. "Thomas Reed, this is Ranger Jack Miller. Are you up there?" Silence. Just the drip of rain and the distant call of a raven, the first bird sound we had heard in almost 2 days. Collins and I exchanged glances. Then we started climbing. The ladder creaked under our weight but held. I went first, rifle slung over my back, hands gripping the wet rungs carefully. The higher I climbed, the more the tower swayed, a gentle movement that was completely normal but felt ominous in the context of everything else. 60 feet up, I reached the platform outside the cabin door. The door was closed but not latched. It swung open at my touch, revealing darkness beyond. The smell hit me first, copper and rot and something else, a musky animal odor that made me gag. I pulled out my flashlight, swept the beam across the interior of the cabin. What I saw made me stumble backward, nearly falling off the platform. Blood. It covered the floor, sprayed across the walls, pooled in the corners. The cabin's single room had been destroyed, furniture overturned, the radio equipment smashed, the cot torn apart with its mattress shredded. And in the center of it all, Something that might once have been Thomas Reed, might once have been human. Collins came up behind me, saw what I had seen, and promptly vomited over the railing. I forced myself to enter, to document, to do my job, even as my mind screamed at me to run, to get down from this tower and flee into the forest and never look back. Reed's body had been torn apart. Not killed. Torn. As if something had pulled him limb from limb, had ripped through flesh and muscle and bone with a strength that no natural predator could possess. What remained was scattered across the cabin floor, pieces that my brain refused to assemble into a coherent image. I found one hand near the window, the finger still curled as if reaching for something. I found part of a leg beneath the overturned table. I found his head in the corner, the face frozen in an expression of such absolute terror that it would haunt my dreams for years to come. And on the wall, written in what could only be blood, a single word: leave. Collins was still on the platform, unable to enter, his face the color of old paper. I took photographs, documented everything with the detached professionalism that training had instilled in me, and tried not to think about what I was seeing, tried not to imagine Reed's final moments, trapped in this tower with something that had climbed up to find him, something that had torn through the reinforced door like it was cardboard. Because that door had been reinforced. I noticed it now, looking more carefully. Extra boards had been nailed across it from the inside. Reed had tried to barricade himself in. It had not helped. The radio was destroyed, but Reed's satellite phone lay on the floor near his severed hand. I picked it up, wiped the blood off, tried to power it on. Nothing. The screen was cracked, the battery compartment crushed. I looked at the destruction around me and realized this had not been random violence. Whatever killed Reed had systematically destroyed every means of communication. It did not want him calling for help. "We need to leave," Collins said from the doorway. "We need to leave right now." He was right. There was nothing more we could do for Reed. We could not even recover his remains, not without a team and equipment we did not have. All we could do was get out, report what we had found, and pray that whatever did this was not still in the area. We descended the ladder faster than was safe, our hands slipping on the wet rungs, our breath coming in ragged gasps. When we reached the ground, the last of the daylight was fading. We had maybe 30 minutes before full darkness, and we were hours from the lake, from the plain, from anything resembling safety. "We make camp," I said. "Right here, at the base of the tower. We build a fire, we keep watch, and we move at first light. You want to camp here, after what we just saw?" "We can't hike in the dark, Collins. Not through that terrain. We'd break an ankle, get lost, or walk right into whatever killed Reed. Our best chance is to stay together, stay alert, and wait for dawn." He wanted to argue. I could see it in his eyes, but he knew I was right. We had no good options, only bad ones and worse ones. We gathered wood, built a fire as large as we could manage, positioned ourselves with our backs to the tower supports and our rifles in our laps. The darkness came quickly, absolute and complete, the fire our only light in a world of black. The silence returned, that oppressive, wrong silence we had hiked through for 2 days. It pressed against us, waiting. The first howl came around 2,100, close, impossibly close, maybe 100 yards away. It was followed by another from a different direction, then a third, then more, too many to count. They were surrounding us. They had been waiting. I saw movement at the edge of the firelight, shapes, low and fast, circling. Then one of them stood. It rose from a crouch to its full height, and I felt my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. Its body was humanoid but wrong. Too long in the limbs, too narrow in the waist, with shoulders that hunched forward and arms that hung past its knees. But the head. God, the head. It was the head of a wolf, massive and elongated, with a long snout filled with teeth that gleamed in the firelight and eyes that glowed amber yellow, reflecting our flames with a light that seemed to come from within rather than without. It stared at us with an intelligence that was utterly alien and completely undeniable. This was not an animal. This was something else, something that had walked out of nightmare into reality. Collins raised his rifle, and I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't provoke it." The creature tilted its head, that too human gesture of curiosity that looked obscene on that inhuman face. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound, low and guttural, that might have been a word. Other sounds answered from the darkness around us, a conversation we could not understand, and then the creature dropped back to all fours and melted into the forest, moving with a speed and silence that something that large should not have possessed. They circled us all night. We heard them moving, caught glimpses of them at the edge of the firelight, saw those amber eyes watching from the darkness. But they did not attack. Not yet. They were studying us, I realized. Learning. Deciding what to do with us. Dawn came slow and gray, the light filtering through the clouds like something reluctant to arrive. The creatures withdrew as the darkness faded, their sounds becoming distant and then silent. Collins and I sat by the dead fire, exhausted, terrified, barely able to speak. "What were those things?" Collins finally asked. "I don't know, but they killed Reed, and I don't think they're going to let us leave." We gathered our gear and started hiking. Not toward the lake, not yet. I had been thinking during the night, forcing my mind to work through the fear, and I had realized something. The creatures had surrounded us, had watched us all night, but had not attacked. Why? We were obviously prey, obviously vulnerable. 2 men with rifles against a pack of those things would not be a contest, so why hold back? The answer came to me as the sun rose. They were herding us, the same way wolves herd deer, cutting off escape routes, driving their prey in a direction of their choosing. Last night they had positioned themselves between us and the lake. Every time I thought about fleeing in that direction, I remembered those sounds, those eyes, coming from exactly where we would need to go. They wanted us to go somewhere else, and I was terrified to find out where. But there was no choice. We could not fight our way through them. We could not call for help. Our only option was to move, to try to reach the lake by a different route, to hope we could outdistance them during the daylight hours. It was a thin hope, barely a hope at all, but it was all we had. We hiked hard and fast, pushing ourselves to the edge of exhaustion. The forest seemed determined to stop us, every fallen tree and thick patch of undergrowth slowing our progress, but we pressed on. Collins was flagging by midday, his breathing ragged, his face pale, but fear kept him moving. Fear kept us both moving. Around 1400, we found another body. It was in a small clearing off the main trail, half hidden under a fallen tree. The uniform marked him as a ranger, but the body was too badly decomposed for identification. He had been dead for weeks, maybe months, and the wildlife had been at him. But even through the decay, I could see the marks of violence, the torn clothing, the broken bones, the evidence of something that had killed him the same way Reed had been killed. I searched his pockets, found a wallet, a ranger badge. His name was Eric Dawson. He had been reported missing 3 months ago, supposedly lost during a solo patrol in this area. The search had been called off after 2 weeks, the assumption being that he had fallen into a ravine or been taken by a bear. Now I knew the truth. Eric Dawson had not been lost. He had been taken. How many others? The question echoed in my mind as we left the clearing and continued our desperate hike. How many missing hikers, lost hunters, vanished rangers had met this same fate? The Tongass was vast and unforgiving, easy to get lost in, easy to die in. Bodies that were never found were assumed to be victims of the wilderness itself. But what if the wilderness had help? What if there were things out here, things that hunted humans, things that had been hunting us for longer than we knew? We made it another 5 miles before they cut us off. The trail descended into a narrow valley, thick with old-growth forest. As we entered, I heard the sounds. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, paralleling our path. Then more footsteps, ahead of us, then behind. They had been tracking us all day, staying just out of sight, and now they were closing in. "Jack," Collins said, his voice tight with panic. "I know, keep moving, don't run." But there was nowhere to move. The valley narrowed to a bottleneck ahead, the sides too steep to climb. Behind us, the sounds were getting closer. They had driven us here, herded us to this place, and now they were closing the trap. I stopped, raised my rifle, waited. Collins did the same, standing back to back with me, covering the other direction. The forest went silent, even the rain seemed to stop. Everything held its breath. Then they came. They emerged from the trees in a wave, too many to count, pouring down the slopes and blocking the trail ahead and behind. Up close, in the gray daylight, they were even more horrifying than they had seemed at night. 8 feet tall on average, some even taller, their bodies a grotesque fusion of human and wolf, covered in fur that ranged from dark brown to black to reddish gray. They moved on 2 legs, upright, but wrong, their gait rolling and predatory. And their faces, those wolf faces with their long snouts and glowing eyes and mouths full of teeth, they stared at us with an intelligence that was terrible in its awareness. The largest one stepped forward. It was easily 9 feet tall, its fur streaked with gray, its body crisscrossed with scars that spoke of countless battles survived. This was the Alpha, I realized. The leader. It studied us with those amber eyes, and I felt like I was being measured, evaluated, judged by something that saw me as nothing more than potential prey. Collins's rifle barked, the shot deafening in the enclosed valley. The creature he aimed at staggered, then straightened, then looked down at the wound in its chest with what might have been annoyance. It pulled something from the wound, a bullet, flattened against muscle that should not have been that dense, and tossed it aside. Then it growled, a sound that vibrated in my bones, and Collins screamed. Two of them hit him from the side, moving faster than anything that large should move. He went down, his rifle flying from his hands, and they were on him. I heard bones breaking. I heard him screaming for help, screaming my name, begging. I raised my rifle, fired, worked the bolt, fired again, but it was like shooting into a wall of flesh. They barely noticed. Then the Alpha was in front of me, so close I could smell its breath, hot and foul, reeking of rotting meat. It did not attack. It just stood there, looking at me, its eyes boring into mine. And then it spoke. The sound was barely recognizable as language, a guttural growling that should not have been able to form words. But words they were, rough and broken, dragged from a throat not designed for human speech. Run. Tell. All know. It reached out, impossibly fast, and swatted the rifle from my hands. Then it stepped aside, clearing a path through the circle of creatures, a narrow gap leading back the way we had come. I looked at Collins. He was still alive, barely, pinned beneath two of the creatures, his eyes wild with pain and terror. He reached toward me with one broken arm. "Jack, please, don't leave me." The Alpha growled again, and the meaning was clear. Leave now, or die. I ran. God forgive me. I ran. I left Collins there, screaming, and I ran back up the trail we had descended. Ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out and I collapsed in a stream bed, sobbing, unable to go any further. Behind me, the screaming stopped, and then the howls began, rising into the gray sky, a chorus of triumph that echoed off the mountains. I do not remember the next 2 days clearly. Fragments, flashes, hiding in a hollow log while footsteps passed nearby, drinking from a stream so cold it made my teeth ache. Eating berries that might have been edible, might have been poisonous, not caring either way. Moving, always moving, not toward the lake. I had lost all sense of direction, just away, anywhere away from those things. They followed me. I know they did. I heard them sometimes, saw glimpses of them watching from the shadows, but they did not attack. They had delivered their message, and I was carrying it. They wanted me to survive. They wanted me to tell. On the third day, I stumbled onto a logging road. An hour later, a truck found me, a logging crew heading back to town after a long shift. They took one look at me, blood-streaked and wild-eyed and barely coherent, and threw me in the back, drove me to the hospital in Juneau. I told them there were creatures in the forest, that they had killed my partners, that we needed to send help immediately. They nodded and exchanged glances and assumed I was suffering from exposure and trauma. The search teams found what was left of Thomas Reed. They found what was left of Henry Collins. They found more footprints, more claw marks, more evidence of something that should not exist. They photographed everything, filed reports, and then the reports disappeared, reclassified, sealed. The official story became equipment failure, bear attack, tragic accident. 2 rangers dead in the line of duty, mourned and buried and forgotten. They did not believe me. The doctors, the investigators, my supervisors, none of them believed what I had seen. PTSD, they said. Trauma-induced psychosis. The mind protecting itself by creating a narrative that externalized the horror. They sent me to a psychiatrist, put me on medication, gave me medical leave. They were kind in their way. They thought they were helping. But I know what I saw. I know what killed Reed and Collins and God knows how many others. And I know what the Alpha said to me in that valley, those broken words that play through my mind every night when I try to sleep. Run, tell, all know. They wanted me to spread the word, to warn others, to tell the world that there are things in the deep forests, things that have been there longer than us, things that see us as prey. They let me live so I could deliver that message. So here it is. My testimony, my warning, my confession of the horrors I witnessed and the partners I lost. The Tongass National Forest covers 17 million acres, most of it unmapped, unexplored, untouched by human presence. In those vast expanses of ancient trees and eternal twilight, things dwell that science refuses to acknowledge. They have been there for thousands of years, perhaps longer. The native peoples knew about them, built their lives around avoiding them, wove warnings into their myths and legends. We dismiss those warnings as superstition. We were wrong. They are called many things in different cultures. The Dogman of Michigan and Wisconsin, the Beast of Bray Road, the Wahila of the Canadian Northwest. The natives of Alaska had their own names, words I cannot pronounce, stories I once dismissed as primitive fear of the unknown. But they are all describing the same thing, a creature that walks upright like a man but has the head and teeth and hunger of a wolf. A creature that hunts in packs, that marks its territory, that kills without mercy but not without purpose. A creature that is intelligent enough to understand us, to communicate with us, and to decide whether we live or die. I resigned from the Forest Service 6 months after the incident. I could not go back into the woods, could not close my eyes without seeing those amber eyes staring back at me, without hearing Collins's screams, without feeling the Alpha's breath hot on my face. I moved south, as far from the forest as I could get, to a city where concrete covers the earth and lights burn all night and the wild is kept at bay by walls and roads and the hum of civilization. But they are still there, in the Tongass, in the Cascades, in every vast wilderness where humans rarely venture. Waiting, watching, hunting, and sometimes, late at night, when the city grows quiet and the darkness feels too close, I hear it. That howl, carried on a wind that should not be able to reach this far, reminding me that I am alive only because they allowed it. That I carry their message not by choice, but by command. That I am, in a sense, still their prey, released to serve a purpose. I think about Reed often. About the terror in his dead eyes, the barricade he built that did not save him, the word he wrote in his own blood, leave. He must have seen them coming, must have known what was about to happen, must have spent his final moments trying to warn anyone who came after him. I hope his death was quick. I hope they did not make him suffer. I think about Collins more, because I left him, because I ran while he screamed for help, because I chose my own survival over any attempt to save him. The guilt is a weight I carry every day, a poison that no therapy can neutralize. I tell myself there was nothing I could do, that trying to save him would have only gotten us both killed, that the Alpha gave me a choice and I made the only rational decision. But rationality provides cold comfort in the small hours of the night when his voice echoes in my memory and I see his reaching hand and I feel the cowardice burning in my chest. They gave me a medal, survivor of a tragic incident, heroic efforts to rescue his fallen comrades. The ceremony was small, the citation vague, and everyone involved seemed eager to get it over with. I threw the medal in a drawer and have not looked at it since. I did not survive through heroism. I survived because they let me go. Because I was more useful to them alive than dead, carrying their message into the world of men. Run, tell, all know, so I tell. I have written this account as completely and accurately as I can, sparing no detail, hiding nothing. I know most people will not believe it. They will call me crazy, traumatized, a victim of my own damaged mind. Let them. I know the truth, and maybe, somewhere, someone will read this and think twice before venturing into those dark places where the old things dwell. Maybe someone will heed the warning that the native peoples tried to give us for generations. Maybe someone will survive because I told my story. Or maybe not. Maybe we are too arrogant, too certain of our dominion over nature, to accept that we are not the apex predators we imagine ourselves to be. Maybe we will keep sending people into those forests, keep losing them to accidents and bear attacks and unexplained disappearances, keep ignoring the evidence because it does not fit our understanding of the world. Maybe we deserve what is coming, because they are getting bolder. Since my encounter, I have been monitoring reports from the Tongass and other wilderness areas. Sightings are up, disappearances are up. Attacks on hunters and campers that are attributed to bears, but have characteristics that do not match bear behavior. Something is changing. The things in the forest are becoming more active, more aggressive, more willing to show themselves. I do not know why. Maybe their territory is shrinking as we push further into the wild. Maybe their population is growing and they need more hunting ground. Maybe they are simply tired of hiding. Whatever the reason, I believe a reckoning is coming. The line between their world and ours, maintained for centuries by mutual avoidance, is breaking down. Soon, there will be encounters that cannot be explained away, bodies that cannot be hidden, evidence that cannot be denied. And then humanity will have to decide what to do about a species that sees us as prey, that has been hunting us since before recorded history, that is stronger and faster and more patient than we can imagine. I do not know what that decision should be. Part of me wants to say we should hunt them down, exterminate them, make the forests safe for human use. But another part of me, the part that looked into those amber eyes and saw intelligence looking back, wonders if we have the right. They were here first. The forests belonged to them long before they belonged to us. We are the invaders, the encroachers, the ones who have been steadily destroying their habitat for centuries. Maybe they are just defending what is theirs. Maybe we are the monsters in this story. I do not have answers. I only have my testimony, my experience, my burden of truth that no one wants to hear. I share it now because the Alpha commanded me to share it, because Collins deserves to have his death mean something, because Reed's warning deserves to be heard. The Tongass National Forest is not safe. The wilderness is not empty. And if you venture too far from the trails, stay too long in the shadows, wander too deep into the territory they have marked and defended for millennia, you will learn the same lesson I learned. We are not alone in those mountains, and we are not welcome. 3 years have passed since Tower 3. I live in a small apartment in Seattle now, working a desk job that keeps me indoors, surrounded by people, far from any forest. I have not been camping since the incident, have not even walked through a city park after dark. The wild places have become forbidden territory. Places I cannot go without feeling their eyes on me, without hearing their howls echoing in my memory. I thought I was safe here, thought the city would protect me. But last month, something happened that made me realize the truth. They know where I am. They have always known. I was walking home from work late evening, taking my usual route through a quiet residential neighborhood. The streetlights were on, casting pools of orange light at regular intervals. Traffic hummed on the nearby arterial. Everything was normal, civilized, safe. Then I saw it, standing in the shadow between two houses, barely visible, watching me. The shape was unmistakable, even in the darkness. 8 feet tall, shoulders hunched forward, eyes glowing faintly amber in the dim light. I froze, could not move, could not breathe, could only stare at that impossible shape, that nightmare-made flesh, standing 100 feet away in the middle of Seattle. It watched me for a long moment. Then it raised one clawed hand in what might have been a wave, or a salute, or a reminder, and then it was gone, vanishing into the shadows between the houses, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. They have followed me, or they have always been here, in the margins, the shadows, the wild spaces that persist even in our cities, parks and green belts and urban forests and the strips of vegetation that line our highways. They move through these spaces, watching, waiting, keeping track of the one who carries their message. Run, tell, all know. I am still running. I will always be running. And I will never stop telling, no matter who believes me, no matter what it costs me, because the alternative is to let their warning go unheard, to let more people stumble into their territory unprepared, to let the killing continue without any attempt to explain or prevent it. This is my purpose now. This is why they let me live, not out of mercy, not out of kindness, but because I am useful, a voice crying in the wilderness, trying to warn the deaf, a messenger who will never stop delivering the message. The forests are not empty. The wild is not safe. And when you hear the howling in the night, when you see the eyes watching from the darkness, when you feel that presence at the edge of perception, know that they are there. They have always been there, and they will remain long after we are gone. I have told my story. I have delivered their message. What you do with this information is your choice. But remember, when you make that choice, that I warned you, that Thomas Reed warned you with his dying breath, that Henry Collins screamed his warning into the uncaring night. The dogmen of the Tongass are real. They are watching, and they are hungry. May whatever gods you believe in protect you if you ever wander into their domain, because nothing else will. This is the testament of Jack Miller, former ranger, sole survivor of the Tower 3 incident, bearer of a message from the things that dwell in darkness. Read it, remember it, and for the love of all that you hold dear, stay out of the deep woods. They do not belong to us. They never did, and we are not welcome. I was hired to watch empty rooms, a windowless office, flickering monitors, and 8 hours of silence every night. The library closed at midnight, but something inside it never slept. At first, the cameras showed nothing, just long halls and dark reading rooms. Then things started appearing where they shouldn't be. No alarms, no alerts, just movement. And the feeling that I was being watched. This is what happened during my overnight shift at the library. My name is Marcus Webb, and I spent 3 years working the graveyard shift at the Ashworth Public Library in Northern Ohio. When people ask me why I left, I tell them I found a better job. That is a lie. The truth is, something drove me out of that building, something I still cannot explain, something that visits me in my dreams and makes me afraid to close my eyes in dark rooms. I am writing this now because I need someone to believe me, and because I need to warn anyone who might take the job after me. The Ashworth Library is not just a building full of books. It is something else entirely, and whatever lives inside those walls is patient, intelligent, and very, very hungry. I took the security job in the fall of 2019. I had just turned 32 and was going through a difficult divorce. My ex-wife Elena had taken the house, the car, and most of my self-respect. I needed work, any work, and the overnight security position at the library seemed perfect. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and I would not have to deal with people asking me why I looked so tired all the time. The interview was conducted by a woman named Patricia Holloway, the head librarian. She was in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She asked me the usual questions about my background and experience, but there was one question that struck me as odd. She leaned forward across her desk, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, and asked me if I was the type of person who got scared easily. I laughed and told her I had served 4 years in the Army and had done 2 tours overseas. I told her nothing scared me anymore. Patricia Holloway did not laugh. She simply nodded, made a note on her clipboard, and told me I could start the following Monday. The Ashworth Public Library was built in 1923, funded by a wealthy industrialist named Howard Ashworth, who had made his fortune in steel. The building was massive, 4 stories of red brick and Gothic architecture that looked more like a cathedral than a public library. There were gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their stone faces worn smooth by a century of rain and wind. The windows were tall and narrow, filled with stained glass that depicted scenes from classical literature. During the day, the library was a beautiful place, filled with natural light and the quiet murmur of patrons browsing the shelves. But at night, when the lights went out and the doors were locked, the Ashworth Library transformed into something else entirely. The shadows grew longer, the silence grew heavier, and the building seemed to breathe around you, as if it were alive and aware of your presence. My first week on the job was uneventful. I would arrive at 11:30 each night, check in with the evening staff as they prepared to leave, and then begin my rounds. The library had a security office in the basement, a small room with concrete walls and a bank of 12 monitors connected to cameras throughout the building. My job was simple. I would sit in that room, watch the monitors, and make hourly rounds through the building to ensure everything was secure. The library had an extensive collection of rare books and manuscripts, some of them worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, so security was taken seriously. I carried a flashlight, a radio, and a set of keys that could open every door in the building. I was told to call the police if I saw anything suspicious, but Patricia Holloway made it clear that false alarms were not tolerated. She told me the previous security guard had called the police 3 times in 1 month, each time convinced he had seen someone in the building. Each time, the police had found nothing. The previous guard had been let go shortly after, and Patricia Holloway told me she hoped I would not make the same mistakes. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked why the previous guard had been so convinced someone was in the building. I should have asked why Patricia Holloway's hands trembled slightly when she handed me the keys. I should have asked why the evening staff always seemed so eager to leave, practically running for the exits the moment the clock struck midnight. But I did not ask any of these questions because I needed the job and because I was arrogant enough to believe that my time in the Army had prepared me for anything. I was wrong. The first strange thing happened on my 8th night. I was sitting in the security office watching the monitors when I noticed something on camera 7. Camera 7 covered the East Reading Room on the 2nd floor, a large space filled with oak tables and antique lamps. The room was empty, as it should have been, but one of the lamps was on. I stared at the monitor for a long moment, trying to remember if that lamp had been on when I made my 11 o'clock round. I was certain it had not been. I picked up my flashlight and headed upstairs to investigate. The library was silent, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing off the marble floors. I climbed the main staircase to the 2nd floor and walked down the long hallway toward the East Reading Room. The hallway was lined with portraits of former library directors, their painted eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. I reached the reading room and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The lamp was off. I stood in the doorway, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and I felt the first prickle of unease crawl up my spine. I was certain the lamp had been on. I had seen it on the monitor, glowing warm and yellow in the darkness. But now the room was completely dark, and when I walked over to the lamp and touched the bulb, it was cold. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself the monitor had glitched, or my eyes had played tricks on me. I went back to the security office and tried to forget about it, but over the following weeks, the strange occurrences multiplied. Books would be found on the floor in the morning, pulled from shelves that I had checked and found orderly just hours before. Doors that I had locked would be found unlocked. The elevator would move between floors on its own, the ancient machinery groaning and clanking in the silence. And then there were the sounds. Footsteps in empty hallways, whispers from darkened corners, the soft rustle of pages turning in rooms where no one should be. I began to dread my nightly rounds, my heart pounding as I walked through the shadowed stacks, my flashlight beam trembling in my grip. It was during my third week that I first saw the figure on the monitors. I was doing my 2 o'clock check, scanning through each camera feed, when I noticed movement on camera 4. Camera 4 covered the main reading room on the first floor, a vast space with vaulted ceilings and rows of long wooden tables. The room was dark, except for the pale glow of the emergency exit signs, and for a moment I thought I saw something move between the tables. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the screen. There, in the far corner of the room, I could see a shape. It was tall and thin, standing motionless in the shadows. I could not make out any details, just a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the faint light around it. I watched for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the shape to move. But it remained perfectly still, and the longer I stared at it, the more I began to doubt what I was seeing. It could have been a coat rack, I told myself. It could have been a shadow cast by one of the tall windows. I picked up my flashlight and my radio and headed upstairs to investigate. The main reading room was on the first floor, just off the main lobby. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the marble floor. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. I walked through the rows of tables, checking every corner, every shadow. There was no coat rack, no piece of furniture that could have created the silhouette I had seen on the monitor. I stood in the far corner where the figure had been standing and looked around. There was nothing there but empty air and the faint smell of old books. I told myself I had imagined it, but even as I walked back to the security office, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following night, I saw the figure again. It was on camera 9 this time, standing at the end of a long corridor on the 3rd floor. The corridor was lined with tall bookshelves, their upper reaches disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the emergency lights. The figure stood at the far end, perfectly still, facing the camera. I could not see its face, could not make out any features at all. It was just a shape, a darkness in the shape of a person. I watched it for nearly 10 minutes, waiting for it to move, waiting for some indication that it was real. It never moved. Finally, I gathered my courage and went upstairs to investigate. When I reached the 3rd floor corridor, the figure was gone. There was nothing there but empty shelves and the musty smell of old paper. This became a pattern over the following weeks. Every night, I would see the figure on one of the monitors. It was never in the same place twice. Sometimes it was standing in a doorway. Sometimes it was sitting at a table in one of the reading rooms. Sometimes it was standing at the far end of a long hallway, barely visible in the dim light. But no matter where it appeared, it was always watching, always facing the camera. And every time I went to investigate, it was gone by the time I arrived. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The stress of the divorce, the isolation of the night shift, the oppressive silence of the empty library. Maybe it was all getting to me. I considered quitting, but I needed the money, and I was too proud to admit that an empty building had gotten the better of me. It was in early November when things took a darker turn. I was making my 3 o'clock round, walking through the basement archives, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, soft and distant, echoing through the concrete corridors. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to hear. The voice was whispering, but I could not make out the words. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of me, from the rare books vault at the end of the corridor. I gripped my flashlight tighter and continued forward, my footsteps impossibly loud in the silence. The corridor ended at a heavy steel door with a keypad lock. The rare books vault contained the library's most valuable items, including a collection of medieval manuscripts and a first edition of Paradise Lost. I punched in the code and pulled the door open. The vault was small, maybe 15 feet square, with climate-controlled cabinets lining the walls. My flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the glass cases and their precious contents. The room was empty. There was no one there. But as I turned to leave, I heard the voice again, clearer this time, and I realized with a shock of terror that it was coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slashing through the darkness. There was nothing there. The vault was empty, the corridor behind me was empty, and yet I could still hear the whispering, soft and insistent. like someone speaking just behind my ear. I ran. I am not ashamed to admit it. I ran back through the basement, up the stairs, and did not stop until I was back in the security office with the door locked behind me. I sat there for the rest of the night, watching the monitors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup. I did not make any more rounds that night. The next morning, I almost told Patricia Holloway what had happened. I almost told her about the figure on the monitors, the whispers in the basement, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong with the building. But when I walked into her office, she looked at me with those cold, knowing eyes, and I lost my nerve. Instead, I asked her a question that had been bothering me for weeks. I asked her what had happened to the previous security guards. Patricia Holloway was silent for a long moment. Then she told me that the position had a high turnover rate. She told me that most guards lasted only a few months before finding other employment. When I pressed her for details, she became evasive. She told me that some people were simply not suited for overnight work, that the isolation and the silence could play tricks on the mind. She told me that if I was having difficulties, I was welcome to resign at any time. There was something in her voice, something that sounded almost like a warning. I thanked her for her time and left her office without another word. I should have quit that day. I know that now. But I was stubborn, and I was broke, and I convinced myself that there had to be a rational explanation for everything I had experienced. Old buildings made strange noises. Security cameras had glitches. The human mind, especially under stress, could see things that were not there. I told myself these things over and over again until I almost believed them. And so I kept coming back, night after night, to sit in that basement office and watch the monitors and pretend that everything was normal. It was 3 weeks later, on the night before Thanksgiving, that everything changed. The library was closed for the holiday, which meant I was alone in the building for the entire night. No evening staff to check in with, no one to call if something went wrong. Just me and the monitors and the endless, oppressive silence. I arrived at 11:30 as usual and began my first round. The building felt different that night, though I could not say exactly how. The air seemed heavier, the shadows seemed darker, and there was a tension in the atmosphere that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I completed my round quickly and retreated to the security office, telling myself I was being paranoid. At 1:15 in the morning, I saw the figure again. It was on camera too, standing in the main lobby near the circulation desk, but this time something was different. This time the figure was not standing still. It was moving, walking slowly across the lobby toward the main staircase. I watched, transfixed, as it climbed the stairs and disappeared from the frame. I quickly switched to camera 5, which covered the second-floor landing. The figure appeared a moment later, walking with that same slow, deliberate pace, heading toward the east wing. I switched to camera 7. The figure walked into the east reading room and stopped in the center of the space, directly beneath the antique chandelier. And then, for the first time, it turned to face the camera directly. I still cannot describe what I saw. The figure had no face, or rather, its face was a void. A darkness so complete that it seemed to pull the light from the air around it. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me, so intense that I could not breathe, could not move, could not look away from that faceless darkness staring at me through the monitor. And then the figure raised one hand and pointed directly at the camera, directly at me. The monitors went black. All 12 screens flickered once and then went dark, plunging the security office into complete darkness. I sat there in the blackness, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, listening to the sudden total silence. The hum of the computers was gone. The soft whir of the air conditioning was gone. Even the distant tick of the old clock in the lobby was gone. There was nothing, only darkness and silence and the overwhelming certainty that I was no longer alone. I fumbled for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the concrete walls of the security office, the dead monitors, the door that led out into the basement corridor. I knew I should stay in the office. I knew I should wait for the power to come back on. But something was pulling at me, a compulsion I could not explain, drawing me out of the relative safety of that small room and into the darkness of the library. I stood up on shaking legs, crossed to the door, and stepped out into the corridor. The basement was pitch black except for the pale beam of my flashlight. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls, my breathing loud and ragged in my ears. I passed the rare books vault, past the storage rooms filled with old furniture and forgotten donations, and climbed the stairs to the first floor. The lobby was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight and the faint glow of the exit signs running on battery backup. I swept my beam across the room, across the circulation desk and the rows of public computers and the tall windows that looked out onto the empty street. The lobby was empty. I crossed to the main staircase and began to climb. I do not know why I went to the East reading room. I do not know why I felt compelled to go to the exact spot where I had seen the figure on the monitor. It was as if something was guiding me, pulling me forward against my will. I climbed to the second floor and walked down the long corridor toward the east wing. The portraits on the walls seemed different in the darkness, their painted faces twisted into expressions of fear and warning. I reached the reading room and pushed open the door. The room was not empty. There were people sitting at the tables, dozens of them, sitting motionless in the darkness. My flashlight beam swept across their faces, and I saw that they were not people at all, not anymore. They were hollow, empty, their eyes dark pits and their mouths hanging open in silent screams. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, some in modern dress and some in fashions from decades past. A woman in a flapper dress sat next to a man in a three-piece suit. A teenage boy in a varsity jacket sat across from an elderly woman in a housecoat. They were all perfectly still, like mannequins, like statues, and yet I could feel them watching me, could feel their empty eyes tracking my movements as I stood frozen in the doorway. And then one of them moved. The woman in the flapper dress turned her head slowly, her neck making a dry, crackling sound, and she looked directly at me. Her mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and a sound came out that I cannot describe. It was like a whisper and a scream at the same time, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that filled my head and made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I ran through the corridor and down the stairs and across the lobby, and I did not stop until I burst through the emergency exit and out into the cold November night. I sat on the steps of the library, shaking and gasping for air, watching the dark windows for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The library was silent and still, just a building, just brick and mortar and glass. I sat there until the sun came up, and then I went home and did not leave my apartment for 3 days. I quit the job, of course. I called Patricia Holloway and told her I would not be coming back. She did not seem surprised. She simply thanked me for my service and told me my final paycheck would be mailed. There was no curiosity in her voice, no concern. It was as if she had been expecting this, as if she knew exactly what I had seen and was simply waiting for me to break. In the months that followed, I tried to forget what had happened. I moved to a new city, found a new job, tried to build a new life, but I could not stop thinking about the Ashworth Library, about the figure on the monitors, about those hollow people sitting in the darkness of the East reading room. I began to research the library's history, spending my nights scouring old newspaper archives and historical records, trying to find some explanation for what I had experienced. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. The Ashworth Public Library was built on the site of an old poorhouse that had burned down in 1891. The fire had killed 47 people, mostly indigent and mentally ill patients who had been locked in their rooms for the night. The bodies were so badly burned that most could not be identified, and they were buried in a mass grave on the grounds. When Howard Ashworth purchased the land in 1922, he had the grave dug up and the remains moved to a potter's field on the outskirts of town. Local historians noted that many of the bones had been damaged during the excavation, scattered and mixed together until it was impossible to tell which remains belonged to which victim. But that was not the worst of it. The worst came when I began to research the history of the library itself, the decades of strange occurrences and unexplained events that had been carefully documented and then quietly buried. I found newspaper clippings about library patrons who had disappeared without a trace, about staff members who had suffered mental breakdowns, about security guards who had quit in the middle of their shifts and refused to explain why. I found a police report from 1958 about a graduate student named Arthur Chen who had been found dead in the rare books vault, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his hair turned completely white. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as heart failure, but there was a note in the margins, scribbled in pencil by one of the investigating officers. The note said 3 words: he saw something. I found records of a renovation project in 1974 that had to be abandoned when 3 construction workers reported seeing a figure standing in the basement, a figure that vanished when they approached. I found an interview with a former head librarian named Margaret Ellis, who had resigned in 1989 after claiming that the building was haunted by the ghosts of the poorhouse victims. She had told reporters that the spirits were angry, that they had been disturbed when their graves were desecrated, and that they would never rest until they were properly mourned. Margaret Ellis died in a psychiatric hospital in 1993. Her death was ruled a suicide. The more I researched, the more I found, and the more I found, the more certain I became that something terrible was living in the Ashworth Library. Not ghosts, not exactly. Something older and hungrier, something that fed on fear and isolation and the dark hours of the night. The poorhouse fire had opened a door, and Howard Ashworth had built his library right on top of it. The thing that lived there now was not the spirits of the dead. It was something else, something that wore their faces and used their forms to lure the living into its trap. I tried to warn people. I wrote letters to the library board, to the mayor's office, to the local newspapers. No one listened. No one believed me. I was just another disturbed former employee, another casualty of the night shift. Patricia Holloway sent me a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if I continued to spread what she called malicious falsehoods about the library. I stopped writing letters after that, but I never stopped watching, never stopped paying attention. In the years since I left, 3 more security guards have quit the Ashworth Library. 2 of them moved out of state. 1 of them disappeared entirely. His apartment found empty. His belongings untouched, his car still parked in his usual spot. The police investigated but found nothing. He is still listed as a missing person. I know what happened to him. I know because it almost happened to me. The thing in the library took him, just like it took Arthur Chen, just like it took all those people sitting in the East Reading Room. They are still there, all of them sitting in the darkness, waiting for the next person to walk through those doors and never come out. I am telling this story now because I have received news that the Ashworth Library is hiring again. They are looking for a night security guard, someone to watch the monitors and walk the empty halls between midnight and dawn. The salary is good, the benefits are decent, and the job description makes it sound almost peaceful. A quiet position for someone who enjoys solitude, it says. No experience necessary. If you are thinking about applying, I am begging you, do not. Find another job, any other job. Work at a gas station, work at a fast food restaurant, work at a warehouse loading trucks in the middle of the night. Anything is better than what waits for you in the Ashworth Library. Because once it sees you, once it knows you are there, it will never stop watching. And one night, when the monitors go dark and the silence closes in around you, it will come for you. And you will join those hollow people in the East Reading Room, sitting in the darkness forever, waiting for the next victim to walk through the door. I still have nightmares about that night. I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear whispers coming from the darkness outside my window. I still cannot bring myself to enter a library after dark, cannot walk past the Ashworth building without feeling my heart begin to race. The thing in the library marked me somehow, and part of me knows that it is still waiting, still watching, still hungry. This is my warning, my confession, my plea for someone to believe me. The Ashworth Public Library is not what it seems. There is something living in those walls, something ancient and malevolent and patient beyond human understanding. It has been feeding on people for over a century, and it will continue to feed for centuries more unless someone finds a way to stop it. But I do not think anyone can stop it. I think it is too old, too powerful, too deeply rooted in that building and that land. All we can do is stay away, keep our distance, and pray that it never decides to expand its hunting grounds beyond those red brick walls. My name is Marcus Webb, and I was hired to watch empty rooms. What I found there was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Some doors should never be opened. Some buildings should never be entered after dark. And some jobs are not worth any amount of money in the world. If you ever find yourself in northern Ohio, drive past the Ashworth Library. Look at those Gothic spires and those stained glass windows and those gargoyles perched on the roof. Admire the architecture from a safe distance. But whatever you do not go inside, especially not at night, especially not alone, because something is waiting in there, something that never sleeps, something that watches through every camera and listens through every wall. And if it decides it wants you, there is nowhere you can hide and nothing you can do. Trust me. I know. I learned the hard way that some places are better left alone. The Ashworth Library taught me that lesson, and I will carry the scars of that knowledge for the rest of my life. I only hope that by sharing my story, I can save someone else from making the same mistake. Stay safe. Stay away from empty buildings and dark hallways and jobs that seem too good to be true. And if you ever hear whispers in the silence or see shadows moving where nothing should move, run. Do not investigate. Do not try to be brave. Just run and do not look back. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. This is Marcus Webb, signing off. I hope you never have to learn the truth about the Ashworth Library. I hope my story is just another creepy tale on the internet, something to entertain you for a few minutes before you move on with your day. But if you find yourself standing outside those red brick walls, staring up at those dark windows, remember what I told you. Remember the empty rooms. Remember the flickering monitors. Remember the figure with no face, and walk away while you still can. The library closes at midnight, but something inside never sleeps, and it is always, always watching. I thought my story was over when I left Ohio. I thought that by putting distance between myself and the Ashworth Library, I could escape whatever had taken root in my mind during those dark months. I was wrong. The thing that lived in that building did not need physical proximity to reach me. It had marked me during my time there, left some invisible stain on my soul, and no matter how far I ran, I could never truly get away. The nightmare started a month after I left. At first they were vague, formless things, just a sense of dread that followed me into sleep and lingered after I woke. But as the weeks passed, they became more specific, more detailed, more terrifying. I would find myself back in the library, walking those empty halls, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I would see the figure standing at the end of a corridor or sitting at a table in one of the reading rooms. And always, always, it would turn to face me. That void where its face should be pulling at my sanity like a black hole pulling at light. In some dreams, I would be back in the East reading room, surrounded by those hollow people with their empty eyes and silent screams. They would rise from their chairs, moving toward me with slow, shuffling steps, reaching out with gray, withered hands. I would try to run, but my legs would not move, would not obey the desperate commands of my brain. I would stand there, frozen, as they closed in around me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, their whispered voices filling my head with words I could not understand. I woke from these dreams drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my throat raw from screaming. I tried sleeping pills, tried meditation, tried therapy. Nothing helped. The dreams came every night, relentless and inescapable, wearing me down until I could barely function during the day. I lost my new job. I lost my new apartment. I spent my days in a fog of exhaustion and fear, my nights in a prison of nightmare and memory. It was during this period that I began to see things while I was awake. Small things at first, a shadow that moved when nothing was there to cast it, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision that vanished when I turned to look, the feeling of being watched, even in brightly lit rooms, even in the middle of crowded streets. I told myself it was the lack of sleep, the stress, the lingering trauma. But deep down, I knew the truth. The thing from the library had followed me. It was not finished with me yet. The first time I saw the figure outside the library was on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I was sitting in a coffee shop near my new apartment, staring blankly at a laptop screen, when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up and saw it standing on the sidewalk outside the window. It was just a dark shape, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun, but I recognized it immediately. The tall, thin form. The absence of features, the absolute stillness that no living thing could maintain. I stared at it for a long moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then a bus passed by, blocking my view for just a second, and when it was gone, so was the figure. I left the coffee shop and ran back to my apartment, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I locked the door behind me and checked every window, every closet, every corner of every room. I was alone. Of course I was alone. The figure had not followed me, could not follow me. It was just a hallucination, a trick of my exhausted mind. I repeated these words to myself like a mantra, but I could not make myself believe them. The sightings continued over the following weeks. I would see the figure in crowds, standing motionless while people flowed around it like water around a stone. I would see it in windows, reflected behind me when I looked in mirrors and shop fronts. I would see it standing at the foot of my bed when I woke in the middle of the night, its void face turned toward me, its presence filling the room with a cold so intense I could see my breath misting in the air. And always, when I blinked or looked away, or turned on a light, it would be gone, leaving nothing but the memory of terror and the lingering certainty that it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I considered going back to Ohio. I considered confronting whatever was in the Ashworth Library, demanding answers, demanding release from this torment. but I knew that was exactly what it wanted. The thing in the library was patient. It had been waiting for over a century, feeding on fear and darkness and the slow erosion of human sanity. It could wait a little longer. And when I finally broke, when I finally surrendered and walked back through those doors, it would be ready for me. So I fought. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, every shred of willpower that had not been worn away by sleepless nights and waking nightmares. I started researching ways to protect myself, delving into the obscure corners of folklore and the occult that I had always dismissed as superstition. I learned about salt lines and iron wards, about protective symbols and cleansing rituals. I covered my apartment in sigils I did not understand, burned sage until my neighbors complained about the smoke, slept with an iron blade under my pillow. I do not know if any of it helped. I do not know if there was anything that could help against a force as old and powerful as the thing in the library. But doing something, anything, made me feel less helpless, less like a lamb waiting for the slaughter. The turning point came 6 months after I left Ohio. I received a letter in the mail, hand-addressed in old-fashioned script with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in dense, cramped handwriting. The letter was from Margaret Ellis. Margaret Ellis had been the head librarian who resigned in 1989, the one who had claimed the library was haunted, the one who had died in a psychiatric hospital. But the letter was dated just 3 days earlier. The writing was lucid and coherent, describing in precise detail everything I had experienced during my time at the Ashworth Library. The figure on the monitors, the whispers in the basement, the hollow people in the East Reading Room. It was as if Margaret Ellis had been watching me, recording my every move, waiting for the right moment to make contact. The letter ended with an invitation. Margaret Ellis wrote that she had found a way to stop the thing in the library, a way to close the door that had been opened over a century ago. She wrote that she needed my help to complete the ritual. She wrote that if I did not come, if I did not face my fear and return to the source of my torment, the thing would never stop hunting me. It would follow me for the rest of my life, growing stronger, drawing closer, until finally it consumed me entirely. There was an address at the bottom of the letter, a location in the countryside outside of the town where the Ashworth Library stood. A meeting place, a final chance. I knew it was probably a trap. I knew that Margaret Ellis had died in 1993, that the letter could not possibly be from her. But I also knew that I could not keep living like this, could not spend the rest of my life running from shadows and seeing monsters in every dark corner. If there was even the slightest chance that the letter was genuine, that there was a way to end this nightmare, I had to take it. I bought a bus ticket back to Ohio. I packed a bag with everything I thought I might need: salt, iron, matches, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a copy of every protective symbol I had found in my research. I did not know what I would find when I reached the address on the letter. I did not know if I would survive the night. But I was done running. I was done being afraid. Whatever was waiting for me in Ohio, I was going to face it head on, and I was going to either destroy it or die trying. The bus ride was long and uneventful. I spent most of it staring out the window at the passing countryside, watching the sunset and the darkness creep in from the edges of the sky. I arrived in town just after midnight, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. The streets were empty, the shops were closed, and the only light came from the street lamps casting pale pools of illumination on the cracked sidewalks. I rented a car from the only agency that was still open, a 24-hour place near the bus station staffed by a bored teenager who barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the keys. I punched the address from the letter into the GPS and started driving. The route took me out of town and into the countryside, past farms and fields and stretches of forest that seemed to swallow the headlights whole. The further I drove, the darker it got, until finally the GPS announced that I had arrived at my destination. I was parked in front of an old farmhouse, the kind of place that had probably been beautiful once, but had been abandoned and left to rot decades ago. The windows were broken, the roof was sagging, and the porch was covered in fallen leaves and debris. There was no light inside, no sign that anyone had been here in years. But parked in the driveway, covered in a layer of dust but still recognizable, was an old station wagon with Ohio plates. I got out of the car and approached the farmhouse, my flashlight in one hand and the iron blade in the other. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them, and the front door swung open at my touch, its hinges shrieking in the silence. Inside, the house was a maze of shadowed rooms and collapsed furniture, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. I moved through the darkness, my flashlight beam sweeping from side to side, my heart pounding in my chest. I found her in the basement. Margaret Ellis was sitting in a chair in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that had long since burned down to stubs. She was old, impossibly old, her face a map of wrinkles and her hair a thin white cloud around her skull. But her eyes were sharp and bright, fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. She smiled when she saw me, a smile that held no warmth or humor. "Welcome, Marcus," she said. "I have been waiting for you." I asked her how she was alive, how she had survived all these years, how she had found me. She laughed at my questions, a dry, brittle sound like dead leaves rustling in the wind. She told me that death was not an escape from the thing in the library. She told me that she had died in that psychiatric hospital, just as the record said, but that dying had not freed her. The thing had claimed her spirit, bound it to the building, used her as a lure to draw others into its web. She was not truly alive, she said. She was something else now, something in between, existing in the spaces between life and death, memory and oblivion. But she had retained some small part of herself, some spark of the woman she had been. And over the long years of her imprisonment, she had learned things. She had learned the nature of the thing in the library, had discovered its origins and its weaknesses. She had found a way to destroy it, to close the door that had been opened when the poorhouse burned. But she could not do it alone. She needed someone from outside, someone who was still alive, still connected to the world of the living. She needed me. I asked her why I should trust her. I asked her how I knew this was not a trap, not some elaborate scheme to deliver me to the thing that had been hunting me. She told me I had no reason to trust her, no reason at all. But she also told me that I had no other options. The thing would never stop. It would follow me until I died, and then it would claim my spirit just as it had claimed hers. The only way to be free, the only way for either of us to find peace, was to destroy it once and for all. I looked at her sitting there in the candlelight, this ancient woman who had been dead for decades, and I made my decision. I told her I would help. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, I would do what needed to be done. Margaret Ellis nodded slowly, her bright eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Good," she said. "Then we begin tonight." She told me the ritual would have to be performed in the library itself, in the very heart of the thing's power. She told me we would need to enter the building at the darkest hour of the night, the hour between 3 and 4 when the veil between worlds was thinnest. She told me there would be dangers, horrors beyond anything I had experienced. But if we were strong, if we did not falter, we could end this. We could destroy the thing and free its victims. We could close the door forever. We drove back to town together in my rented car. Margaret Ellis, sitting in the passenger seat like a corpse propped up for a funeral viewing. She did not speak during the drive, did not move except to occasionally turn her head and stare at me with those unnervingly bright eyes. I focused on the road and tried not to think about what we were about to do. The Ashworth Library loomed before us as we approached, its Gothic spires and stained glass windows dark against the night sky. The building looked different somehow, more menacing, as if it knew we were coming and was preparing itself for battle. I parked the car in the empty lot and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret Ellis reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a key, old and tarnished and ornate. "The master key," she said. "It opens every door in the building, including the one that matters most." I took the key and examined it in the dim light from the street lamps. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, and I could feel something humming inside it, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the building before us. We entered through a side door, a service entrance that led into the basement. The library was even darker than I remembered, the emergency lights that should have been glowing softly along the corridors completely extinguished. Margaret Ellis walked beside me, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor, her presence a cold spot in the warm summer air. I followed her deeper into the building, past the security office where I had spent so many terrifying nights, past the rare books vault where I had heard the whispers, down a corridor I had never noticed before to a door I had never seen. The door was small and unassuming, just another patch of wall, unless you knew exactly where to look. Margaret Ellis pointed at the door and told me to use the key. I slid the old tarnished key into the lock and turned it. There was a click, loud in the silence, and the door swung open. Beyond the door was a staircase, spiraling down into a darkness so complete that my flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed whole. The air that rose from below was cold and damp and smelled of earth and decay. "This was it," Margaret Ellis said. "The heart of the building, the place where the door was opened, the thing's true home." We descended. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling down and down and down until I lost all sense of time and direction. The walls were stone, rough and ancient, covered in symbols that I recognized from my research. Protective wards, binding sigils, attempts by previous victims to contain what they had unleashed. None of them had worked. The thing was still here, still hungry, still waiting. At the bottom of the stairs was a chamber. It was large and circular, the walls lined with alcoves that held ancient books and scrolls and artifacts I could not identify. In the center of the room was a circle inscribed on the floor, filled with more symbols and surrounded by candles that burned with a pale, ghostly light. And standing in the center of the circle, waiting for us with that void where its face should be, was the figure. I froze when I saw it, every muscle in my body locking up, every thought in my mind dissolving into blind, paralyzing terror. The figure stood motionless, its darkness absolute, its presence filling the chamber with a cold so intense I could feel it in my bones. This was it, I realized. This was the thing that had haunted my dreams, that had followed me across states, that had been waiting for me to return since the moment I first set foot in this building. Margaret Ellis stepped forward, her voice rising in a chant I could not understand. The words were old, older than English, older than Latin, older than any language I had ever heard. They seemed to twist the air around her, to create patterns of light and shadow that danced across the walls. The figure reacted, its void face turning toward her, its presence focusing on her with an intensity that made my ears ring and my vision blur. She told me to complete the ritual. She told me to light the candles in the proper order, to speak the words she had taught me during the drive, to focus my will on the thing in the center of the circle. She told me not to look away, not to flinch, not to let my fear overcome me. She told me this was our only chance. I do not know how I found the strength to move. I do not know how I forced my trembling hands to light the candles, forced my dry throat to speak the ancient words, forced my mind to focus on the thing before me when every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But I did it. I completed the ritual, just as Margaret Ellis had instructed, and I watched as the thing in the center of the circle began to change. It shrieked, a sound that was not a sound, a vibration that I felt in every cell of my body. The void where its face should be began to crack, to fracture, to splinter with lines of blinding white light. The darkness that had cloaked it began to peel away, revealing something beneath that I cannot describe. Something so alien and terrible that my mind simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I looked away, finally, unable to bear it any longer, and I saw Margaret Ellis standing at the edge of the circle, her body dissolving into light, her face transfixed with an expression of peace. And then it was over. The thing was gone. The chamber was empty. The candles had burned out, leaving only wisps of smoke curling toward the ceiling. Margaret Ellis was nowhere to be seen, but somehow I knew she was finally free, finally at rest after all those years of imprisonment. The door had been closed. The nightmare had ended. I climbed back up the spiral staircase, back through the basement, back out into the warm summer night. The library looked different now, smaller somehow, less menacing. It was just a building, just brick and mortar and glass. Whatever had lived inside those walls was gone, and it would never come back. I drove out of town that night, and I have never been back. I do not know what happened to the Ashworth Library after I left. I do not know if the staff noticed that something had changed, that the shadows were lighter and the silence was less oppressive. I do not know if the hollow people in the East Reading Room were finally released, if their spirits were able to move on to whatever awaits us after death. What I do know is that the nightmares stopped. The sightings stopped. The feeling of being watched, that constant, gnawing terror that had been my companion for so many months, faded and eventually disappeared entirely. I was free. Against all odds, against everything I had believed was possible, I had faced the darkness and survived. I still think about those days sometimes, those long nights in the security office watching the monitors, those moments of pure terror when I saw things that should not exist. I think about Margaret Ellis and the sacrifice she made, about all the victims who were trapped in that building for so long. I hope they found peace. I hope the door stays closed forever. And I hope, whoever you are reading this, that you never have to face what I faced. I hope you live a long and happy life, free from the knowledge that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the dark corners and wait for the unwary. I hope my story is just a story to you, a creepy tale to read on a quiet night, something to give you a pleasant shiver before you move on with your day. But if you ever find yourself in an old building late at night, if you ever feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something is watching, remember what I told you. Remember that some doors should never be opened. Remember that some places are better left alone. And run. Run and do not look back. Because you never know what might be following you out of the darkness. My name is Marcus Webb. I was hired to watch empty rooms, and this is the true story of what happened during my overnight shift at the library. Stay safe out there, and keep your lights on. You never know who might be watching from the shadows.